Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country today. I'd like to welcome you to the first installment of our new webinar series, Code Red. My name is Gail Rakowski, and I'm the Executive Director of NASSTRAC. We have a great lineup for you today, and we appreciate your sharing your time with us. As we are all aware, the world is getting increasingly chaotic, particularly as it relates to supply chain and transportation. Today, our panelists will share with you their insights and thoughts on how we can best navigate this new terrain. Our moderator today is Mike Regan of TranzAct Technologies and NASSTRAC's Advocacy Chair. Mike, it's all yours.
Gail, thank you very much. And we've got hundreds signed up for this webinar, and I'm really excited about it. And let me just jump right in. We basically came up with the Code Red designation here for people. And the reason we did that was because there are all sorts of things that are happening in the transportation marketplace. And so one of the things I thought would be beneficial for you here was if I just gave you kind of set it up as to what exactly is happening. And with respect to the marketplace, Gail had brought up the fact that we have some great people here, and I'd just like to introduce them. We've got Avery Vise, who's the VP of Trucking for FTR, which is the preeminent transportation and logistics research firm, headed up by my buddy Eric Starks. We have Eric Fuller, who is the president and CEO of US Xpress. We have Geoff Muessig, who's the executive vice president with Pitt, Ohio, and the chief marketing officer for the organization. And our friend who you've heard from numerous times, Jerry Hempstead, long distinguished career in the consulting side. And we have some great stuff that we're going to be sharing with you. Just to kind of set what we're going to be looking at here. General marketplace observations, volatility. Volatility is the big story. And the reason for that is basically, many of you would surmise, COVID has had a significant impact on transportation, logistics, and supply chain areas. Jerry's going to touch on this and give you some information about the explosion in e-commerce sales. We're all staying at home. We're all having products and shipments delivered to our houses. We've also created what we call COVID-induced uncertainty in corporate supply chains. And what we're seeing there are, Avery's going to touch on where our inventory to sales ratio models are looking like and some of the impact as companies realign where they're sourcing product from. We've got reduced operational capacity at DCs and warehouses as companies have either basically reduced the hours, furloughed workers in response to that. But what we also have is the use of alternate suppliers has created changes in the freight flows. Now, one of the things that we like to highlight, and this is a report that Avery sent me here about a month and a half ago, and he'd be happy to update this for you if you would like to see information. One of the things that is really unusual is what Geoff highlighted for us on a pre-conference call, and that is shippers are experiencing business cycles over a 4 to 5 month cycle instead of a biannual 2 to 3 year cycle. So this chart on the left is put out by FTR. It is a shipper condition index. And what you'll see there is that in April, what that is showing was volume was very soft, which meant that shippers had a lot of leverage in their negotiations with carriers. Fast forward to August, it is now down to a very low number, and it has stayed in that range, which means that carriers have a lot of leverage. If you take a look at the market demand index, which is produced by our friends at Truckstop and FTR, it'll show these numbers are just stratospherically high, which is why many of you on this call today may be seeing difficulty securing capacity from your core carriers. And obviously, Avery's going to touch on this, the spot rates, and we're seeing the year-over-year increases that we have here. I'm not going to dwell too much on this because Avery will touch on it, but what we're seeing across the board, and it's leading to conditions that many of us have never seen before, is additional factors to consider. Jerry's going to touch on what the parcel markets are doing, UPS and FedEx, when they're instituting surcharges on their heaviest volume customers, and we're seeing parcel carriers at a regional level completely booked up. We're seeing carriers being asked to handle more non-traditional freight. Geoff will touch on that. The LTL carriers, we're seeing embargoes, and it's not just one or two carriers. We have been having discussions with shippers, many discussions over the past month in particular, and you're seeing some of the largest, most service-oriented carriers having challenges. Geoff's going to touch on that. How are climatic events like the fires out west or the hurricanes in the southeast impacting supply chains? Railroads, Union Pacific imposing a $3,500 surcharge if you exceed certain volume thresholds. And then the thing that everyone is concerned about, and Eric is going to be addressing as well, is the absence of surge capacity. What does that mean as you head into peak season? Now, I'm not going to touch on this because I'll steal Eric's thunder, but after talking with Eric on our pre-conference call, a lot of people, ourselves included, were taking a look at projected truckload rate increases for 2021 of 5 to 7%. Instead, Eric has brought up some things that are going on. I also serve on the board of a publicly traded truckload carrier, and we're looking now projected truckload rate increases of 8 to 10%. On the LTL market, we're looking at 4 to 6% GRIs, and Geoff is going to touch on how some of the COVID conditions are impacting the LTL carriers. What does it mean when it takes additional time to unload trucks because of restrictions at various docks? On the LTL overview, Geoff will also touch on some attributes associated with looking at how carriers determine rates. Extremely important information here. And then Jerry will touch on what to expect in the parcel market. And just, it wouldn't be a Code Red webinar if we didn't show you that we also could talk, but really don't have time to talk about what's going on in the intermodal market. One of the questions that was asked was, how do we get additional intermodal capacity? Talk to our friends over at the Hub Group. They are shipping train loads of containers from places like Harrisburg and Jacksonville out to the West Coast. The West Coast is reporting the ports are seeing a 50% increase in volume there. The ocean containers, I don't have time to share the stories with you. Just yesterday, I was out with the customer talking to them. They're paying about $2,000 more to move their containers from Shanghai to the West Coast. And we're seeing some disruptions in the air market. So I'm going to stop for now. And that's why we are calling it Code Red, because we have not seen these kind of conditions across all modes happening simultaneously. For those of you that are CEOs and presidents, share this with your team. For those of you who report up to the C-level executives, we will provide copies of this presentation as well as recording of this particular session here. And I'm looking forward to the questions and answers. And to facilitate that, if you will go to the Q&A tab on your Zoom, we can keep track of that. And I will now turn it over to Avery Vise, our friend from FTR. Avery, pick it up.
So thanks, Mike. So my role, as Mike set up, is to sort of continue to set the stage for my esteemed panelists who are really going to be talking about the day-to-day, the nitty-gritty. They're the ones that are in the trenches dealing with all of this stuff. My mandate is to continue to set sort of a broader view of what the overall freight market is doing, and let them talk about some of the struggles that they're dealing with and some of the potential solutions. I get to just look at the data for the most part. And I do have a handful of slides to illustrate this, but you can download all of those slides and a few others at ftrintel.com/code-red. So let's just very quickly, this is probably the world you're living in right now, so I don't have to spend too much time on it, but let's look at real-time or near real-time data on the three principal segments: dry van, refrigerated, and flatbed. And I'm using spot market data here. You see a very similar picture if you look at outbound tenders, and there's a number of different metrics you could look at, but they're all showing more or less the same picture. Dry van loads in the truckstop.com system are running at all-time highs, have been for about 2 months now. We're down from a record that was set about 6 weeks ago, but basically we're holding steady more or less at record levels. And we don't normally do this. You know, if you go back and look at 2018, which is the orange line, you know, we are above that peak, or actually very close to that peak, but we weren't at that peak for very long. And we were already, you know, sort of at that level. So this is a very strong market. You know, prior to September, you look back to that June 2018, as you'll see in the next 2 slides, that was the peak of the market in terms of volume up until now. If you look at refrigerated, you know, we see something similar in that it's quite strong, and it did exceed for 1 week the record that we had in 2018. It exceeded that right before Labor Day. You'll see that while it is running ahead of 2018, it's not exceeding 2018 to the degree dry van is. It is not as hot, if you will, as dry van is, although it is, of course, very strong. And then flatbed is an interesting one because we haven't come close to matching the load volumes that we saw through really pretty much the first half of 2018. But we are running far above volumes in the back half of 2018. And probably more to the point, we've seen more improvement in flatbed recently than we have in the other segments. But then again, of course, flatbed is not at those record levels as the other two are. So to sum up there, we have strong spot volumes in all segments, but dry van is really the one that's operating most consistently at high historical levels. And if we look at the macro economy, we really get a pretty good sense as to why this is happening. So let's start with retail and food service sales. So the story of the recovery has been the consumer sector. Retail and food service sales have more than fully recovered from the contraction, and were, in September at least, 4.2% ahead of February. And that's even with taking into account that the restaurant and bars segment is still down about 15%. So overall, retail sales are more than 4% higher, and they have that drag on them from the food service sector. September itself was very strong. Sales were up 1.9%. And that's actually one of the 10 largest gains in a single month on record. We do have some concerns about the sustainability of these types of gains. I'll touch on that briefly toward the end, but right now what I want to do is contrast what's happening in the consumer economy with what's happening elsewhere, and specifically in industrial. So while retail sales are significantly ahead of February, industrial production is significantly behind February, to the tune of about 7%. And adding to the concern was the fact that in September, production actually fell 0.6%. And we have not seen very many indicators fall month over month since we ended the contraction in April. And we saw it in industrial production. It was the first decline after 4 straight months of gain. Of course, a major component of industrial production is manufacturing. That was down 0.3% in September, and it's still more than 6% below February. One key sector for trucking, of course, is motor vehicles and parts, and output in September was down more than 4%, and that was the second straight month of a decline in output of 4% or more. Of course, that followed just enormous gains in May, June, and July. So we're not that far down, but we are certainly still down from where we were in February by, I believe, more than 3%. But the real story, I think, that is behind what's going on, especially with dry van, is the inventories to sales ratios. And of course, strong retail sales that we've had alone would bolster dry van volumes. But the severe contraction that we had in the sharp recovery has created an unprecedented situation in inventories. At this point, inventories in wholesale relative to sales have basically normalized. Inventories to sales ratios in manufacturing are still a bit elevated. So there's no pressure there. And of course, I'm sure as all of you know, the lower that the inventories get relative to sales, the more pressure there is obviously to replenish and the more pressure there is on freight transportation, assuming you do, of course, get inventory to replenish. And that is an issue in some sectors. What is unprecedented here, though, is retail. Through August, retail inventories relative to sales were just about the lowest ever on record. In fact, they were just barely higher than the all-time low, which was in June. And remember that retail sales were very strong in September, and this data is only through August. Now, we don't have inventories data for September yet, but it would take an enormous gain, and in fact, probably a gain larger than we've ever had in inventories in order to keep this inventories to sales ratio from falling to a new record low level. So the inventory situation clearly is still a big issue, well into October, and is certainly a major reason why the spot market is so strong. It's worth noting that the retail inventories are very lean through almost all of the sectors of retail. The only two exceptions, department stores, which at this point have basically come back down to normal levels, and then clothing stores, which are still high by historical standards. And I'm not going to go over all those, but the slide deck that you can download includes charts for each one of those sectors if you want to download that and take a look at it. So, where does all this leave us? As I said, we have this dichotomy between what's going on in consumer and what's going on in industrial. So we have quite a bit of stress, which is, of course, what we're going to be talking about the rest of today on that consumer side. But if we look at the truck market as a whole, our data indicates that we have not fully recovered because the industrial sector still lags, fairly substantially, as we've seen, and we think that is going to continue for some time. However, we do think that by the middle of next year, that we will be back to truck loadings overall that are comparable to where we were before the pandemic. And then we do expect, good solid increases through the rest of next year and into 2022, with trucking conditions being pretty sustainably strong. I mean, right now we have trucking conditions that are extremely tight in some, specific segments of the market. We think that's going to be much more broad-based, by the time we get to the end of next year. By the way, I should point out that this chart reflects our most recent published forecast. We will have a revised forecast on October 31st, which is when we publish our November trucking update. In fact, we had our meeting just this morning, right before this webinar, to review our initial model outputs on volume and rates. I will say there's going to be some significant changes to our outlook, both in volume and rate forecasts. Although this particular chart is not going to change all that much, and the reason is that there's going to be some offsetting strengths. There are going to be some areas where it's going to be considerably stronger in our updated forecast, and some areas where it's going to be noticeably weaker. This forecast will be probably a little bit stronger in the very near term when we publish it in about 10 days. But at least once you get beyond Q1 of next year, it's going to be very much in line with the forecast that you see. I want to close out with one caution regarding what we're seeing in retail, specifically with the September retail sales. There's a good chance that it's an outlier. There's a couple of points here I want to make. One is that the biggest strength we saw was in the areas we would associate with back to school spending, clothing, sporting goods, and department store spending, for example. Keep in mind that, we always look at seasonally adjusted data, and, over time, that is, the best way to look at data. Unfortunately, when we have a a situation like we've had in the last 7 months with these sharp contractions and sharp increases, it does get a little squirrely. And I think one thing that we saw in September is that there was a lot of back to school purchasing that we normally would have seen in July and August. They got pushed off to September because kids weren't literally back in school. They were back in school on computer screens, but it wasn't really until September and really even into October before a lot of school systems returned to their normal flow in in-person instruction. The other thing I want to point out is unemployment. So we have had more than 25 million people receiving unemployment benefits, and as many of you probably know, through July they were getting a very generous $600 a week on top of what they were getting from their states. That ended at the end of July. It was replaced by a Trump administration program called Lost Wages Assistance. But the problem with that was it took weeks to get that going. And we really don't think that very much of the money, based on the data we've seen and from states and also from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, that very much of that money was dispersed in August. We think most of it was dispersed in September, and that's about $44 billion. And it's basically a one-time thing because that program has run out of money. And as we all know, we don't know what Congress and the White House are going to do, but it's certainly not a guarantee. So those are definite reasons to be concerned. I will add, though, that there is a reason to be optimistic, and that is that due to all the stimulus that we had earlier in the year, and especially the stimulus payments and the Paycheck Protection Program, consumers still have quite a bit of cash. And then the other thing is that until we have a vaccine, we almost certainly will see a lot less spending on things like vacations, movie theaters, concerts, and the like. And so we should continue to see consumers spend more money on goods relative to services. So those would be offsets. And with that, Mike, I'll turn it back over to you.
One of the things I'm going to encourage you to do is to share this information throughout the organization. If you are the president and CEO, share it with your team. If you're managing the transportation, make sure you share it upstream, because we're going to turn it over to Eric and get down into the weeds here about what to expect on the truckload side, and then Geoff will be up next. So Eric, take it away.
Thanks, Mike. So if you think about the truckload, and I think it's a really good segue from Avery, because I think you set it up perfectly. If you think about the truckload sector, very sensitive to supply and demand. If you think about the demand side of the business, obviously demand, if you think about 19, probably one of the weaker markets that the truckload market's seen, though I would argue that really was a supply story. Demand stayed fairly consistent. It was robust, but we had too many drivers or trucks built into the market from 18 to 19. And keep in mind that number is roughly about 40,000 additional trucks. The way I measure it, about 40,000 additional trucks came into the market between, say, 17, 18 into 19, that caused the market to feel incredibly weak in 19 and into early 20. As we got into 20, with a lot of the trucks coming out of the market, whether they through bankruptcies or drivers leaving the market, with incredible weakness, we saw people kind of reducing their truck count. We started to see the market kind of come back to equilibrium right around early March. I would say that it started to feel like a normal market again. We were moving maybe more into a tighter environment. And then obviously the COVID shutdown happened, and March and April, things were kind of turned on its head. As we got into May, the market started to pick back up, and you can see right there with Avery's charts is that from May, I would say sequentially from May to really where we sit today, every single week, things have gotten a little bit tighter. Now, I know that shows a little bit of moderating recently, but the market from our perspective has continued to tighten up. Again, as I mentioned, it's demand and supply. So on the demand side, what we are seeing in large part is a little bit of the haves and have-nots. I think there's haves and have-nots related to the sector they're in. So retail, strong, robust, as we saw with the charts. Industrial, not as strong. And they've seen some weakness through this period and they've not recovered. But I think also, if you look within the retail segments, there's a lot of haves and have-nots too. We have customers, and I would say these are the larger nature customers that are up 20, 30% on an annual basis from shipping volume. So they are up. They're seeing a big surge in demand, while smaller retailers, more regional retailers, more niche retailers, some of those are still off 40 or 50%. In fact, some of the smaller customers that we've talked to have not seen their business even really come back since the shutdowns. And these were people that were probably more that were actually shut down, that have really not seen their businesses come back. And clothing retail is probably a great example. Most people are working from home. People aren't really buying a lot of clothes. So clothing retail is greatly affected, while grocery retail, home improvement, consumer products, those things are booming. And also the shift from what I would call services or experiences. So if you think about the last couple of years, one of the things that we were very aware of in the transportation industry is that the younger demographic is spending more money on services, experiences, so travel, food, those type of things, and less on tangible products. And so we were concerned about where that may lead long-term in our business. What's happened since the shutdown is the exact opposite. Is people are still spending roughly the same amount of money they were, but they're spending it on tangible products. So people are shifting that spend away from services and experiences and travel into actual products. And so demand is fairly robust in this environment, but I don't think that what we're filling is demand related. On a large part, I think it's more supply related. So if you think about the supply market, the driver market, when we entered 2020, we had a drug and alcohol clearinghouse that went into effect. And as of recently, we have about 35,000 drivers that are now in that database that essentially can be excluded from being hired. They can go through a process to get reinstated, but for the most part, what we're seeing is drivers are not doing that. And so I would say about 35,000 drivers are excluded from being hired. Now that's out of 4 million drivers that say have a CDL. So that may seem like a big number, but think of the truckload market, all these other guys that are on here, they're from a driving hiring perspective, they're in a lot better position because the jobs that require CDL, they're much more attractive in the LTL segment or the private fleet or any of the package and any of that's required. Those are more desirable jobs. And unfortunately, the bottom of the totem pole is truckload. And so when you have drivers come out of the overall segment, they typically come out of truckload. Even if they come out of, let's say an LTL driver fails a drug test, then you have a truckload driver probably move upstream to take that job. So the sheer numbers always come out of the truckload. And that's why the truckload industry is so volatile from that perspective. So 35,000 there. And then when we had a shutdown in March and April, many of the truck driving schools were not deemed essential. And so many of them were shut down anywhere from 4 to 8 weeks. And why that's significant, again, if you go back to that 4 million CDL holders, there are people retiring every single year and to the tune of probably a couple 100,000 people that are leaving the industry, whether it be retirement or sick or want to be home. I mean, what have you, they're leaving the industry. And so the influx of new people coming into the industry are coming in through that new CDL driving school. So with those being shut down for 6 to 8 weeks, the pipeline wasn't getting filled up. And I would actually argue that things were actually accelerating on the retirement side because of concerns about COVID and illnesses and things. You had more people leaving. And the reason that not only were the schools shut down, but then you had the outsized unemployment benefits in the stimulus bill. So not only did you have the school shut down, but when they opened back up, we didn't necessarily have this influx of new people like we typically do when there's high unemployment. Unfortunately, our industry is a job of last resort in a lot of cases. So when high unemployment's there, you see people run into the industry. You didn't see that this time, partially because of those unemployment benefits. And now that the schools are open, they're running at, say, half capacity because of social distancing and those type of things. So to date, we've seen about 100,000 less CDLs issued by states than what we saw last year. And then I estimate that as we go through the balance of the year, there's probably about another 50,000 that will be of a deficit versus the back half of 2019 from a CDL perspective. So let's say there's 150,000 less CDLs issued. I figure there's another 20,000 or so drivers that go into the alcohol and drug clearinghouse. And so I think it's likely we will exit 2020 with 200,000 less drivers than we entered 2020 with. Now, drivers and trucks aren't exactly, I mean, they're two different things. So when I talked about 40,000 trucks that moved the market from, say, 17 and 18 into 19, we're talking about drivers, so it's a little different, but the drivers are kind of the lead that obviously requires you to have in order to have the truck. So I don't think there's 200,000 less trucks in the market, but there could very well be by the end of this year, 50 or even 100,000 less because of that driver situation. I think people would ask, well, how do we fix this? Unfortunately, I don't know that there's a near-term quick fix. One of the things that you're going to see over the next couple of quarters, and you're already starting to see the early part of that, is driver wage increase. And when I'm talking about driver wage increases, in the past, they've been kind of the variety of a 5-7% driver wage increase, meaning, they give a penny here, a penny there, that kind of a thing. We're talking about significant driver wage increases, probably closer to the tune, when it's all said and done over the next couple of quarters, of closer to 20%. Where I think that some have given 10%. I think likelihood there will be probably 2 or 3 legs of this, where you'll see maybe a 10 and then a 5 and a 5, or you may see somebody go in all in 20. But I think that you're going to be close to that 20% when it's all said and done in the near term. What that gets you is essentially a reshuffling of the deck. It's not going to get you any new drivers, most likely, maybe a few here and there, maybe a couple that have left the industry will come back to the industry, but you're not probably convincing that guy who's in construction to all of a sudden join the trucking industry. We're not there yet. And so all that's really going to do is reshuffle the deck. One thing for customers to think about is driver wage cost is about 1/3 of our overall cost. So if you think if we have to give a say it's 21% for easy math, 21% increase to drivers, then that's essentially an increase of our cost of 7%. So when Mike was talking about rates having to go up 8 to 10%, you're talking 7% of cost increase just on the driver wage piece alone. You start to look at the inflation we've seen over the last couple of years. You start to look at the fact that we've had downward rate pressure for probably 2 bid cycles. And I think rates, I would probably argue with Mike, I think we're probably in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% that will be needed through this bid season going forward. Partially because of the 7% from the driver wage increase, which is pretty significant. And again, as I mentioned, that 20% isn't going to get you new drivers. So if you ask me, what is it going to take to really fill that deficit of 200,000, I think you're probably talking closer to 40 to 50%, which we're not going to do in this cycle. But I think that that there's a real reason that we're not going to be able to fix this deficit in the near term, because we've got to bring a whole new group of people into the industry. And I don't see a catalyst for that happening unless there becomes an appetite for a 40 or 50% increase. And I think there would have to be a situation where you're talking about, thousands and tens of thousands of loads sitting on docks, not getting picked up for days or weeks at a time before we even got into that scenario. But I think that we're probably going to look at probably one of the tightest truckload markets that we've seen for at least the next 6 to 18 months. And also, if you look back at 17 and 18, it was a 6-quarter cycle. Typically, that's what you see in those strong cycles, about 6 quarters. I think this one has the potential to last 12 to 14 quarters. Now, the economy obviously can do some things that will change that, but I think that based off the supply issue, that this thing could run a lot longer than typical cycles.
Can I interrupt you, Eric, here? Just because I want to make sure that the entire audience grasp what you're saying. Like I said, I serve on the board of a publicly traded truckload carrier. I've tracked the markets, the Wolf Research, Stifel, Morgan Stanley, everyone's looking at 5 to 7%. What you said is just driver increases alone could drive a 6 to 7% increase. And what a lot of you haven't touched on, and we don't have time, is things like insurance, the impact of nuclear verdicts, and the other higher operating costs. And so the other thing for those of you that have responsibility for freight budgeting, and I just want to make sure I put this out, we always focus on your contract to spot ratio factor. If you're 80% contract, 20% spot, if that now goes to 60% contract, 40% spot, Avery, you've confirmed that spot rates are running pretty hot right now, likely to stay real hot. So you have a scenario of 13 to 15%, and I'm just sharing with the audience what we at NASSTRAC, Gail has done a great job of bringing resources together with CSCMP. You do not have budgets that reflect 13 to 15% increases. You're going to get blown to smithereens, which is what happened in 2018. Is that an accurate summation?
Absolutely. I think that's what we're going to be facing probably going into next year.
Okay. I'm going to, Eric, I'm going to turn it over to Geoff. Geoff, you've shared some stuff about the LTL market. Take it away.
Thank you, Mike. Thank you for inviting me to participate on the panel discussion today. I'd like to share a little bit of Pitt, Ohio story here. I do think it's not just emblematic of my company's experience, but probably similar to many other LTL carriers as well. So hit on initially, just four things: what's happened from demand, supply, service, and pricing cost standpoint. So with the onset of COVID-19, mid-March, we operated off the East Coast. It was a real hot spot. We saw a precipitous decline in demand. Our demand fell probably by about 25% at its worst. We started to climb out of that through April, and we've seen a steady increase in shipment count as customers have come back on. As Avery has described in his presentation, how different segments of the economy have recovered. The market has warmed up to the extent that in September, we're now exceeding on a year-over-year basis the results we achieved in September, and that continues even into October. From a supply standpoint, when a business is confronted with a sudden jolt in demand or loss of demand, and you lose 25% of your business, the immediate reaction is how can I right-size my labor force to deal with that? And back in that circumstance, we had no inkling that we would be encountering a V-shaped recovery. We didn't know what to expect. So we offer drivers extended vacations, furloughs, as has been commented earlier. A number of drivers on our team accelerated their retirement plans. A lot of drivers, I like to say, look a lot like me. They're aging baby boomers. And it was a situation where, maybe I was going to retire early in 2021. Well, it might make sense for me to get out second quarter 2020. We employ about 1,800 drivers. About 190 drivers were sidelined at that point. What we did not understand is that the shipment count would start to come back. And we're now in a situation where over the summer months, we saw that our demand far outstripped our supply. We've taken actions around that to prioritize direct shipper business and make sure we're providing the service on that. And we've worked really hard to bring the drivers back off the sidelines. Pitt, Ohio is an employer of choice. As Eric mentioned, we have attractive work hours. We pay 100% of our drivers' medical benefits, late model equipment. There's a lot to like if you're going to drive a truck to drive it at Pitt, Ohio. But with that, we've had it's been an incredibly challenging year this year to get the drivers off the sidelines. I don't expect that to get better in the near term. I would expect that challenge around supply is going to move certainly into 2021. And I would question it may even linger as long as there's to the point where the pandemic's over and there's a widespread dispersion of a vaccine. But that remains to be seen how that plays out. So you back this up around surging demand, constrained supply, and then you need to also understand what's happening with cost. So COVID-19's had a lot of different effects, but one of the ones is it's required a lot of social distancing at work to continue to operate safely. Our customers are engaged in that at the receiving point process, as well as the shipping process. So in the past, where you might have numerous dock doors and allow 3 or 4 drivers to back their trailers up and then unload them sequentially, well, now shippers are being very careful, rightfully so, and they're only allowing one driver on the dock at one time. Well, what might have been a 15 or 20-minute delivery now can stretch into 40, 45 minutes. We do about 14,000 deliveries a day. You add just even 10 minutes to every delivery over 14,000 shipments, and you can see how cost quickly escalates. So, obviously many companies, our customers as well, are spending a lot of money on protective equipment and all that, and cleaning and the labor associated with that. But I think it's the delay at pickup and delivery that's been pretty extraordinary for us in 2020. So I think that, don't want to make this all sound like doom and gloom. I think the key is what can be done from a shipper standpoint as strategies to mitigate the amount of increases that they may be facing. One of the obvious ones is to take a page from the small package space, which for the last 20 years has worked in a digital environment, exchanging information. Unfortunately, the LTL industry is still consigned to paper bills of lading. At Pitt, Ohio, we handle 75% of the shipments we handle every day. A shipper will provide the driver with a piece of paper. We'll bring it back to the terminal. We'll scan it, and then we'll pay somebody at night to keystroke enter that information into our system. In today's day and age, with the easy flow of information digitally, that information should be transmitted during the course of the day. The driver should be in and out, eliminating back office cost, optimizing line haul planning. There are a lot of wins. At Pitt, Ohio, we offer discounts for customers that work with digital bills of lading. A lot of the other tactics, I think, to avoid these rising costs are, it's not rocket science. It's really the basics of embarking on a strategic relationship. I really don't think going out to bid in this environment is going to garner a shipper a much better freight rate in an environment where the suppliers don't have much capacity. The better approach is really to look within their companies at processes and to see how they can present freight in a more attractive way, either at time of pickup or work with their customers at time of delivery to allow that driver in and out to ensure better stowability of that package or that shipment on the truck, to improve load factor, all obvious things that reduce time and space. And if you can make those changes to your shipping operation or the presentment of your goods to the carrier, well, certainly at Pitt, Ohio, and I would say most LTL carriers are at that point willing to gain share the savings that have been achieved. And I think that's really the path forward for strategic shipper and carrier relationships into 2021.
Geoff, can I interrupt just for a second?
Sure.
If you can answer this briefly, because you and I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago. Called up and, a shipper was advised that Pitt, Ohio was not picking up in that area anymore for the time being, due to the shipper said a restructuring. Could you just briefly mention why the embargoes occur and also the surcharges that are being imposed on dimensional freight issues and things like that? Why can you just give us a little snapshot of what's happening there?
So embargoes, Mike, arise in different carrier networks for different reasons. It could be a COVID-19 outbreak that has constrained the number of drivers available at that facility. There's a backup of shipments to deliver. And when an LTL network gets overburdened in that circumstance, it just snowballs. And essentially the carrier needs some time to get those shipments delivered. That can be one approach. At Pitt, Ohio, we have not embargoed any direct shipper relationships. We've prioritized direct shippers ahead of transactional decision makers or 3PLs, where the customer is making a decision day to day based upon the price on that specific day. And essentially what we've done there is we've placed embargoes and raised prices to try to create capacity so we can provide service to our long-term strategic direct shipper relationships.
As you said on the call, you buy transactionally, you'll sell transactionally.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Our intent is to create strategic relationships that are ongoing, that we can flatten the peaks and lower the valleys. The customers that worked with us in April when our business was down 25%, well, obviously those are the customers that we're going to work with to lessen the brunt of any shortage of capacity when things were at their worst.
And I think, Eric, you had mentioned that's the same kind of approach that US Express and most of the other carriers use, as well as
Yes.
driver treatment, you said was very important. Our friend Derek Leathers from Werner has fed, given the premium, you highlighted something there. Potentially you have 150,000 driver shortage. Geoff, I found what was interesting is some of the LTL carriers that have historically not had hot problems finding drivers are reporting issues in retaining and recruiting drivers. And you know, you're going to keep a driver versus a customer that may not treat them as well. Boy, we could keep going on, but that leads us into the parcel market. Fortunately, there's not much happening there, so I can't imagine that Jerry's going to take longer than 60 seconds. But in the unlikely event, Jerry, that there are some things happening, bring us up to date. And one of the questions that we'll fire back on Avery, Eric, and Geoff in a minute there is an issue about how the COVID vaccine, when that gets released, how that's going to disrupt the freight markets. But Jerry, take it away and walk us through what the heck is going on with Parcel.
Well, I've been in the business for 40 years and I've never seen anything like this. And I survived the UPS strike of 97, where all the business had to be diverted from UPS to
Is it
airborne.
code red?
There was a code red in 97. Well, this is beyond code red. The red right now is that the parcel networks are bleeding. They're just, they're full. And we haven't even seen peak yet. You know, as you know, the apex of peak begins the day after Thanksgiving, when people do all their online shopping. The biggest tender day will probably be that Monday after Thanksgiving. So the biggest demand on the delivery networks is going to be that Tuesday. But what happened this year, you know, usually there's a whole year to prepare for peak. Well, because of COVID, everybody started buying stuff on the internet. And by May, we were at peak 2019 levels. So and there was no time to prepare. And now we've maintained that volume. It's become greater and greater every month. And now we're going into peak on top of peak. And that presents all kinds of challenges. And I hate to be the bearer of bad news. You know, it's, let's see if I can get this to come up. One is labor. So Amazon has announced they're hiring 100,000 people. UPS has announced they're hiring 100,000 people. FedEx has announced they're hiring 70,000 people. DHL is hiring thousands of people. Target is hiring, I think, 100,000 people. Walmart, 130,000 people. And we just had a conversation about the driver shortage. Where are all these people going to come from? And so the whole process of how do you source these people, hire them, train them, and get them the equipment. So in my particular neighborhood at peak time, they normally deliver 2 pods to the end of my neighborhood, and they have golf carts in them, and they drop off 2 seasonal workers in November and December who deliver my neighborhood and the other neighborhoods and development I live in. The pods haven't showed up yet, but they're already operating at peak levels. A lot of these hires are temporary that become a driver's assistant. So the driver drives the truck and the assistant runs the package to the resident or the business. And so all of that is going on coincidental to trying to keep packages moving in the network. Now, the other thing we're seeing, because these are publicly traded companies and they have responsibility to shareholders, we're seeing surcharges announced with some regularity. I was on the UPS website earlier today and saw a change in their international surcharge that's going to be effective October 26th. So please go to their website and type in peak surcharges and you'll see this new change on international shipments because of there's all of this demand. And of course, a lot of the passenger flights came down. A lot of the passenger flights have cargo capacity in the bellies. The passenger flights are gone. Therefore, this stuff has to go on companies like FedEx and UPS and Atlas Worldwide and ATSG and some of the cargo operators. Prime Day just was behind us, and Amazon reported an increase of 60% for the small and medium-sized sellers on Amazon. So the small and medium-sized guys are not locked into UPS. They can use whatever carrier they want. So some of that business is in FedEx's network right now. Some of it is in the UPS network right now. Service was already struggling. And once we get to the week after Thanksgiving, we're going to see it struggle some more. So the message to those who are listening, if you have a counterpart that's in charge of customer service, you need to set expectations ahead of time. You can't be making delivery promises because the carriers have eliminated their delivery guarantees some time ago, and we're not going to see it restored anytime soon. So we got prime shipments in the network right now, Prime Day. The other thing that's this predictable surprise, as Mike would call them, they've been working on a COVID vaccine for a while, and shortly it will be announced. Don't know when. It could be in a month. It could be in December. When it hits, that is going to take priority on all of the carriers. So that the vaccine has to board first on the airplanes, on the trucks. It's going to divert manpower. This stuff is temperature controlled. And so one of the things you'll hear the president mention is that they're going to deploy the military. The military has C5 or C-130s. The C-130s can carry refrigerated trailers, but then once you get them to destination, they have to be broken down, and these refrigerated shipments, packed in dry ice most likely, have to be delivered to the distribution point for the vaccine. So where do you get your flu vaccine? CVS, Walgreens, your local grocery store, any place with a pharmacy, I think is going to be where the COVID vaccine is going to be distributed from. That's where you're going to go to get your shot. But we need lots and lots of trucks and drivers to deliver these packages of vaccine and packed in dry ice to the distribution points. And it's going to put a tremendous amount of stress on the parcel network. And so we don't know when the vaccine's going to be approved, but it'll be very quick that once it's approved. You're muted, Mike. Unmute, Mike. There we go.
Let me just throw out a couple questions. Can Geoff and Eric as well. Is there a possibility that shippers experience significant delays? You had said in our pre-call that you could see peak 30% above current levels. Is there, and then Geoff, does that pose challenges for you and the other LTL carriers seeing freight that would have gone truckload or parcel going into now minimum charge status with the LTL carriers? And Eric, you guys are also, the issue that hasn't been touched on, and I'm rambling here a bit, but it is important, is the infrastructure issue is resulting in equipment not being turned. Some of the truckload carriers are reporting, shortages because the shippers, that what you were saying, Geoff, you do 14,000 deliveries a day. You add 10 minutes to that. I'm not good with numbers, but I'm going to go out on a limb. That's 140,000 minutes. That has an impact on your equipment. Does this all add up to an environment, and Avery, you were talking about the dry van issue already. Do we experience gridlock come first week of December, second week of December? Eric, you touched on that at the CSCMP Edge conference. Is that a reasonable possibility, up or down? Eric?
Yeah, I would say it's going to be probably the tightest peak season we've ever seen. And I would say if you don't already have your peak season capacity locked down, I think you're in trouble. Because I think you're going to be in a situation where, just kind of like Jerry is saying, is things are going to increase from here. And if we get into peak season, I don't know that you're going to be able to buy capacity. It's going to be that time.
Okay, Geoff.
So LTL carriers over the last 15, 20 years have been complaining that truckload carriers are taking their heavyweights and the small package carriers are taking their minimum charges. Well, amazingly, in 2020, that situation has reversed, and this business has cascaded back on both ends to carriers. That's another reason why demand is strong in LTL networks today. So heighten that capacity crunch in the small package space. You're only going to see more hundredweight and multi-weight shipments get pushed across, as the small package carriers have already put in seasonal caps That's already out there. It could only get worse. And then if you want to throw in a significant percentage of small package capacity for a period of time being diverted to vaccine dispersion, which is absolutely necessary and should be prioritized, that would only stand to reason the LTL network would get busier.
Okay, Jerry, we had a question come up, so UPS and FedEx imposed their surcharges on some of their highest volume customers if they exceeded the volumes by a certain factor from February. We had a customer ask about Parcel network at a regional level. Add it all up, talk to us very briefly about the regional carriers in the Parcel network. And so for somebody that's got a budget, their parcel shipments, UPS, I think, has announced a 4.9% general rate increase. But then you take a look at their surcharges. Is it a reasonable scenario? Give us a range, 6, 7, 8% increases in overall parcel cost? Because you have not also touched on something you talk on every call, where the CEO of UPS has said that they want to emphasize quality of earnings as opposed to quantity of shipments. Decode that for us all, Jerry, and do it quickly.
Well, UPS hasn't announced their 2021 rates yet, but they have announced all the surcharges for peak. FedEx announced 4.9%, which is what it was in line with what they did the last couple of years. FedEx did introduce a new surcharge for them, 6% if you don't pay your bill on time. UPS already had that rule. And so that may be news to some of the listeners. You got to make sure you pay your bills on time, or you're looking at a hidden.
We can help.
That's right. TranzAct can make sure that you get your bill paid on time. You were talking about capacity. One of the carriers earlier this week told me that they expect to be at 130% of capacity during peak. Well, the balloon is going to burst. The shipments are not going to get delivered on time. The question is, how bad is this thing going to back up, and when can they dig out? Because they're doing what they can to hire the people, but you can't just build a sort center,
You had brought up the fact that you need to have planned for peak a year before. You threw out numbers, I added them up. You're talking about, between Target, Amazon, FedEx, UPS, assimilating 500,000 workers over a 4 to 6 week period. I'm sure they're human resource experts, but I don't know how you assimilate that volume. And, Eric, when you're talking about truck drivers and that type of thing, Geoff, I don't know how you integrate the kind of volume you'd have to. And if I could throw it back to Avery very briefly, Avery, we're looking at this going into at least the first 2 quarters of 2021 based on your research. You're on mute. You're on mute, Avery.
We certainly expect the retail environment to stabilize a bit by the time we get to Q1, but we're in a very different situation than, say, 2018. So we had this big peak in 2018 in the middle of the year, which is not where we are here. We're running at peak levels going into a peak level. So I think one of the things that we're going to see is that the holidays are going to extend into January, just because of all the points that Jerry and Eric and Geoff made, is that you're not going to be able to deliver everything. And then remember, we have a lot of reverse logistics, so that's going to also get pushed off, I think. And so, we're going to be looking at a January and February that are almost just going to be, brought up just because of how tight things are this year. You almost have an echo effect, I think, if nothing else, even if the underlying sales, I think, don't hold up.
So on our call last Friday, I just want to perhaps kind of bring us to a conclusion. And Jerry, overall parcel 6-7% with surcharges?
It never comes out to be that much, but it's going to be, I think the shipper is going to experience more than 4.9.
All right, so let me just throw something at you. One of the things that was highlighted was one of the major retailers that's going gangbusters. And I confirmed it with one of the associates that actually works at this retailer. The out of stock at their store normally runs 225 items out of stock at any given point in time. They are running at 2,500 out of stock items in their store. Avery, you talked about the inventory to sales ratio. And here's what I'm a little bit concerned about. Because of issues with ocean containers, I was talking with the shipper last week. They've added 10 days to their inventory models because of issues with containers being rolled. So Geoff and Eric, that's got to put pressure on you when inventories are that lean for service levels. And Geoff, you had said, Pitt, Ohio is a great carrier, 98% service historically. But, when you go down to a 91, 92% level, as some of the carriers, have said, how do shippers manage the whole inventory equation when you have disruptions in my historical service models? Anything that you got there, Geoff? Yeah.
Yeah. So I would say that align strategically with your carrier. So at Pitt, Ohio, we've kind of made the conscious decision to prioritize our existing customer base. We recognize how busy it is out there, and it's only going to get busier. We've heard that all in the last hour. So we need to be disciplined at Pitt, Ohio, and devote our resources to our existing customers, and not let our eyes wander afar to some new, greener, better, what we perceive to be better opportunity. And if you align with a carrier that takes that disciplined approach, you're going to have your best chance of success. The service may still not be quite what you want. Again, at Pitt, Ohio, we're taking steps to drive that service to 97, 98. But I think that's your best defense as a shipper.
And
I don't know, Eric, what you think?
You're on mute.
Yeah, look, I would agree with Geoff. At US Xpress, we obviously prioritize our long-term relationships. So those shippers that we have long-term relationships with, obviously we're prioritizing those shippers. I would say, though, in general, I would say there's a lot of factors that go into it. And obviously, we talked a lot about rates, but rates really isn't 100% of the factor on who we're gonna do business with and at what scale. And a lot of it is how they treat the driver experience at both the shipper location and the delivery location. And we are starting to use technology to aggregate all that data from our drivers, so we can tell which locations, how long they take to load a trailer, to unload a trailer. What are the appointment times? Are they matching the appointment times? How long are they tying the drivers up, getting into the gate? All of those things we're measuring. Plus, we're actually aggregating what I would call crowdsourcing from the driver, so the driver can tell us about the location and they can rate each location. So what's going to happen as this market stays tight and gets tighter, that we're going to be prioritizing those shippers that strive to treat drivers better, provide more resources, provide bathrooms, provide break areas, even allow drivers to stay on their lot overnight. And those that make it a little more difficult to do business with will probably be deprioritized. And I don't think that's just us. I think it's really the overall industries we're having to move to that model long term.
Just one of the things we wanted to highlight for you, and if you want copies of the presentation, some of you have asked, is the video available? It will be, we'll distribute it. I cannot emphasize, Gail, we did a session at the EDGE conference, grab a seat at the table. This is the kind of information that needs to be shared within your organization. I've talked to several people, directors and VPs, managers of transportation. They're getting slammed because their budgets are getting blown out and people want to know, what do we do? Just very briefly, if you want, we'll send you a copy of this as well. We have an ebook, Managing Your Transportation Spend from the Inside Out, which talks about the need to create a transportation spend management plan. Geoff, you talked about the processes, the things that need to be addressed, and just kind of, these are examples of strategic shippers, how they can manage this. For example, something as simple as expanding the number of hours that your dock is open to accommodate carriers. The other thing is to talk to the LTL carriers and their terminal operator, what's going on at their terminals. Other things, advance notice for tendering freight. Eric, you could probably touch on the fact that it's going to make all the difference in the world if you have to produce a truck in 3 days or if you have 7 to 10 days. Take a look at what COVID, how that will impact. And then finally, if you want additional information, I can't emphasize enough the resources that we provide at NASSTRAC. Gail does a great job, as do our friends at CSCMP. And I wanted to say thank you to Jerry, Geoff, Avery and Eric, you guys did a great job. We'll have a second two other Code Red webinars. Next one is going to really focus on the intermodal ocean markets and the continued impact of supply chain risk issues. So having said that, Gail, if you'll unmute, we'll turn it over to you to close out.
Thanks, everybody. I appreciate what a great job, and thank you for sharing all of your knowledge and insights. And as Mike said, we will be getting to you very soon with the next 2 scheduled webinars. So thanks to everybody and have a good day.